Since 1976, the state of Texas has executed 578 people with the use of death penalty. Texas has had 5 executions within the last year, which makes it tied with Oklahoma for the most executions in 2022. With that being said, the debate on whether the death penalty is a reasonable punishment or has caused a lot of controversy throughout the years. There are sure to be strong arguments on both sides, but as a majority, people tend to disagree with the death penalty. The death penalty is not a reasonable punishment for multiple reasons, including it's not cost effective, it can be inhumane, and over 100 people have been wrongly accused since 1973. The history of the death penalty goes back for hundreds of thousands of years. The first known death penalty was established in the 18th century BC, and it was called the Code of King Harambe of Babylon. The code stated that there were 25 laws that, if they were broken, would be punishable by death. Fast forward a few hundred years, the use of the death penalty became a very popular form of punishment in Great Britain, and by the 1700s, there were over 222 punishable crimes that would lead to death. When the British colonies went west, they brought along the use of the capital punishment. The death penalty was extremely useful back then because it was cost effective and it was a quick way to remove criminals from the general population. Though, as we move into a more modern generation, the death penalty has become a lengthier and more costly process. When debating the death penalty, cost is always a factor that is brought up. The death penalty is not cost efficient in justifying its use. According to Dallas Morning News, the average cost of the death penalty is $2.3 million versus the $570 million for life in prison. $570,000 for life in prison. When you take those numbers and add inflation to them, Law Office Texas Defense Attorney Fred Darr, 2015, says that those numbers would look more like $38 million for the death penalty and $1.3 million for life sentence. That is $2.5 million that proves that the death penalty is just not efficient, and we should not be able to justify it. These arguments on cost also show a large gap that we have in our financial planning that we should be using to improve our prison systems as a whole. Next, the death penalty can be a very inhumane and painful process. On March 25th, 1997, in Florida, Pedro Mardina was sentenced to death by electrocution. During this execution, it was reported that foot-tall flames shot out of the headpiece that Medina was wearing, and he proceeded to burn to death. The officials only cut the power, they didn't help him at all, and he continued to heave and convulse until he eventually died. In this case, and many more like it, the prisoner was set on fire and burned to death, which is not a humane way to die. But another example of a death row execution being inhumane is September 15th, 2009, Ohio, Ramo Brown. The officials stopped trying to execute Brown after 2 hours of failed attempts to bind a vein. During this time, Brown was said to be wincing and just grimacing in pain the entire time, and even was reportedly said to be helping them try to find a vein to use to end the torture. Stated by Professor Rodette in the article, Example of Post-Furman Botched Executions. Broom ended up dying years later due to COVID-19 in 2022 while on death row. Lastly, 200 people have been wrongly accused and sentenced to death within the last 50 years alone. An example of this wrongful conviction is Ruben Cantu. Ruben was not much older than I when he was wrongfully convicted for the murder of a man during an attempted robbery. Later, the key witness of the crime came up and said that he was not the one who did it, but he felt pressured because of the police to say that he was. Moreno, the witness, went on to say that the cops were telling him that they were sure that it was Cantu that did the crime, and that's the only reason why he testified against him. This case was full of regrets from all the parties involved that could have been avoided if the court had used something other than the death penalty. All in all, the death penalty is not a reasonable punishment as it's not cost effective, it can lead to inhumane treatment, and there are hundreds of people being wrongfully executed.